This is DW News live from Berlin, a potential new lifeline for the people of Gaza. With just a trickle of aid reaching civilians, US President Joe Biden is to announce the establishment of a port on the Gaza coast to facilitate the delivery of essential supplies. Also on the programme, Houthi attacks on international shipping turned deadly. Yemen's rebels strike a commercial vessel in the Gulf of Aden, killing 3 people. Survivors abandoned ship and are rescued by the Indian Navy. And President Biden is due to deliver his State of the Union address, hoping to sell US voters on his agenda ahead of a likely election rematch with Donald Trump in November. I'm Phil Gale. Welcome to the programme. US President Joe Biden is to announce a plan to build a temporary port on the Gaza coast to increase the flow of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. White House officials say the president will make the announcement in his annual State of the Union address this evening. It would involve a maritime corridor to bring aid from the Mediterranean island of Cyprus. The US military would help set it up, but authorities have stressed US troops would not be on the ground in Gaza, where residents are in desperate need of food, clean water and medical aid. Let's get more from journalist Sami Sokol in Jerusalem. Welcome back, Sami. How are these reports of a US-built port in Gaza likely to be regarded there in Israel?
Yeah, well, we know that Israel has been discussing these ideas with the Europeans and also with the Americans. But we understand that this statement that is coming now out of Washington hit Israel by surprise. And they did not expect this to come at this time. Some see it as a kind of lack of trust that the Biden administration has towards Israel at this stage. Nevertheless, we already heard an official talking to the Reuters news agency saying that Israel will fully cooperate and Israel fully supports the establishment of such a temporary dock. But we're still waiting here to hear the speech itself of the American president so as to have a kind of more coherent response to this.
OK. Now bring us up to date, if you would, on the negotiations about a ceasefire in this conflict.
Yeah, well, there were delegations that have been meeting in Cairo. And today the Hamas delegation announced that it's leaving. And so this is a kind of a signal of the collapse of any kind of progress that was expected to happen ahead of the month of Ramadan, which is going to begin next week. The delegation said that the talks will resume, the negotiations will resume next week. So, of course, there's always a chance that the parties will be able to bridge the gaps that exist. But if we thought that there would be a ceasefire during the month of Ramadan, well, it's not going to happen, at least not in the beginning of this month. There are, of course, different issues that keep the parties apart. One of them is the way the two parties view this ceasefire. Israel, and we heard Netanyahu today, the prime minister, saying that it will continue the campaign in Rafah, and that without taking Rafah, there will be no victory. And in fact, it will be a defeat for Israel. Hamas, on the other hand, sees the ceasefire as a kind of a beginning of an end to this war. And it wants to have some kind of guarantees that this ceasefire will develop in that direction. So we're now in a serious crisis on this matter.
OK, thanks for that, Sami. Journalist Sami Sokol in Jerusalem. Now, ahead of International Women's Day, which highlights the issue of women's rights across the globe, Women in Gaza say they've been deprived of even the basic ones. The UN says around 1 million of Gaza's displaced people are women and girls. Most are now living in tent camps in the south of the Strip, trying to survive with the little they have.
Cleaning a tent that can hardly replace a lost home. Cooking with very little water. And caring for sick children with no medicine to treat them. The life of displaced women in this makeshift camp in Rafah has turned into what seems to be a never-ending fight for survival.
Women have disappeared. There is nothing left to call woman. We are suffering in every manner. We have been destroyed. We suffer from everything, from poverty, from sadness. There is no food, nothing to drink, no water.
Close to 1 million women and girls in Gaza have been displaced, according to the UN, since Israel's war against Hamas began after the October 7th terror attacks.
I don't have a house. All of my children are ill. Yesterday I wasn't feeling well either. I can't find medicine. I had to beg for it. Because of the flies, I had to get up to clean and disinfect the place.
Mothers in Gaza are facing a daily challenge to keep themselves and their children alive with the very little they have, and to cope with desperation as there is no end to this war in sight.
What have we done to have to live like this? Now, I have lost a year of my life. What have I gained from this war? What have we gained? We have been destroyed. Our schools are gone. Our families are gone. What have we gained from all this war?
Questions that so many women in Gaza ask every day, and that continue to go unanswered.
Well, the conflict between Israel and Hamas has drawn in rebels, the Houthi rebels from Yemen, who are supported by Iran. The Houthis have now launched their first deadly attack on a merchant ship. At least 3 sailors were killed and 4 others wounded when an anti-ship missile hit the cargo vessel True Confidence in the Gulf of Aden on Wednesday. The ship's operators say it was left drifting and on fire. Survivors were picked up by the Indian Navy. Now, the US military says it has since carried out 2 strikes against 2 aerial drones in a Houthi-controlled area of Yemen that presented an imminent threat.
The attack on the Barbados-registered True Confidence marks a significant escalation by the Houthis. As well as the deaths, the surviving crew were forced to abandon ship. Days earlier came the first sinking of a vessel in the Red Sea, as the Houthis fired missiles at the British-owned freighter Ruby Mar. The ship went down with 21,000 tons of fertilizer on board, raising fears of an ecological disaster. The Houthis say they are attacking shipping in retaliation for Israel's offensive in Gaza. The group, which is backed by Iran, has disrupted traffic in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, one of the world's busiest shipping routes.
All crews of targeted ships must quickly leave after the first strike. The many armed forces will continue to fulfill their religious, moral and humanitarian duties in supporting the oppressed Palestinian people.
US and British airstrikes on Houthi targets in Yemen have so far failed to deter the rebels.
The Houthis have continued to launch these reckless attacks with no regard for the well-being of innocent civilians who are transiting through the Red Sea, and now they have unfortunately and tragically killed innocent civilians. And so the United States will continue to hold the Houthis accountable for their attacks.
The big fear is that the Houthis' campaign against shipping in the Red Sea could have a significant long-term impact on international trade, leading to supply shortages and pushing up global inflation.
Let's pick this up with Ibrahim Jalal, who researches Yemen and the Gulf region and has just returned from Yemen. Welcome to DW. Let's first of all start with the Houthis' intentions. Have Houthis been trying to kill people all along or just to deter shipping?
Thanks for having me. I think the latest attack on the ship that stole the lives of three crewmen does constitute a major escalation and is a part of a broader attempt not only to disrupt shipping, but to maximize the damage the damage inflicted by both those on the ships, but also a reflection of a broader story that started in Yemen 2 decades ago.
Right. So as far as we can tell, it has always been their intention to not just deter shipping, but to kill as many people in this area as they can.
Yeah, the Houthis stated at the beginning of the campaign, in November, when they launched their first Red Sea attack, that they will only target Israeli ships. That has not been the case. The scope of targeted vessels, as evidenced by many ships, included other nationalities. So it's not too clear how it benefits the Palestinian cause or how it really affects Israel alone. It in fact affected the global supply chain and the sinking of a ship, Ruby May, just a few days ago, with dangerous phosphataminium that went into the Red Sea water, does affect Yemenis and Red Sea littoral states. It affects the fisheries sector, which feeds hundreds of thousands of families in the Red Sea region. So the disruption now is at a global stage, but it's also at a domestic level in Yemen.
Right.
And I'm not too sure how the Houthis justify that for the public or even have credibility when these attacks affect their very own people.
So did they just get lucky, if I can use that phrase, this time? Because there are all sorts of navies out in that area. The US is there, the British are there, the French are there, India's there. They're all out there, and I suppose the Houthis just have to get lucky just once in order to achieve their aims.
The Houthis know what they're doing. The Americans and the Brits, unfortunately, do not know the strategic long-term game. And the limits of this policy making has been very obvious, that the Houthis have been also leveraging it to their favor by not only testing waters, but continuing to constantly increase the level of damage, with the United States and the United Kingdom and the international community falling just short apart. And that's sustained by the Houthi ability to hold territory over the Red Sea, which means addressing power imbalances in Yemen is key to addressing Red Sea crisis, which can manifest and repeat itself in the future under situations of geopolitical tensions as we see today, with the backing of Iran, of course.
Right, just briefly, for us, just expand on that idea that you pose there, that the US and Brits out there don't know what they're doing.
I mean, the stated objective is degrading Houthi capabilities, and to the extent that they cannot adequately disrupt a supply chain over land and, at sea, the Houthi capability will not be degraded as much. And we've heard multiple statements first claiming degradation of 20 to 30%, but that's not necessarily the case. And this degradation is only relative. It needs, a broader story of having a strategy that connects the Red Sea crisis to the roots of the conflict, not addressing the symptoms of what we see today, which is basically the manifestations of a globally disrupting capability that's ungoverned and far from respectful of international laws, including UNCLOS and Geneva Convention.
OK, thank you for joining us and talking us through that. Ibrahim Jalal, Yemen and Gulf researcher. Thank you so much. We'll take a look at some other stories making headlines around the world. 3 military-ruled West African countries have announced plans to set up a joint force to fight Islamist terrorist groups. Niger, Mali and Burkina Faso have seen numerous attacks by the groups in recent years. Their militaries have promised to end insurgencies in the Sahel region, but violence has worsened under their regimes. Emmanuel Macron has pledged unwavering support for Moldova amid mounting tensions between the country and pro-Russia separatists. The French president and his Moldovan counterpart, Maya Sandu, signed a defence accord aimed at boosting Moldova's sovereignty and security. They called on Russia to withdraw its forces from the breakaway Transnistria region. Austrian property mogul Irene Benko has filed for bankruptcy months after his real estate firm Signa went bust. Signa had stakes in the Chrysler building and Selfridges. Mr. Benko famously used to boast that only the British royal family and the Pope had a more exclusive property portfolio. Haiti's government is extending a state of emergency and nighttime curfew in an effort to curb violent gang attacks in the capital, Port-au-Prince. Gangs have continued to attack police stations and other institutions as police struggle to contain the unrest. The gangs have demanded the resignation of Prime Minister Ariel Henry. Now to the United States, where President Biden's State of the Union address tonight is an opportunity for him to lay out his agenda ahead of an expected election rematch with Donald Trump. It's also a chance for the 81-year-old to reassure the growing number of voters who are concerned about his age.
Joe Biden is in a bind. Amid low polling numbers and a series of public gaffes, widespread concern over his age and his fitness as a candidate does not appear to be fading away.
Yes, I'm worried about his age, and yes, I think he should step down.
The Democrats will be more likely to win if somebody else was the nominee.
I do think it's time for younger people to finally have their say.
A recent poll conducted by the New York Times and Siena College shows that a majority of voters who supported Biden in the 2020 elections say he's too old to be an effective leader in a second term. His Republican rival, former President Donald Trump, though only a few years younger and also prone to confused statements, has fewer voters saying they're worried about his age. Now that the Super Tuesday primaries are in the rearview mirror, delegates will soon officially hand the nomination to Biden in August at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. As such, the polls are worrisome, as are Biden's public stumbles appearing to embody voters' concerns. It's even led some to ask, could there be an alternative to Biden? And this late in the game, how would that even work? Well, an alternate candidate to the president could materialize with cooperation from, well, Biden.
You would have a lot of maneuvers.
Political scientist Larry Sabato explains that theoretically, Biden could step aside and make way for another candidate.
Here's how it could happen. If a candidate withdrew, the candidate receiving a majority of the convention delegates withdrew, then in essence, the convention would have to decide what the rules are. They would at least start out with a lean toward Kamala Harris, toward the vice president. But I'm sure there would be other candidates.
There is, of course, theory, and then there's reality. Biden is unlikely to ever step aside.
He has spent his entire life trying to get to be president. And incredibly, at the age of 78, he made it. Do you seriously think that he would step aside willingly before the Constitution requires him to do so? If Democrats had an obvious, very popular nominee, then maybe there would be some pressure from the people who count on Biden to withdraw. Well, there isn't, and therefore there isn't.
If the question of replacing Biden is a non-starter, and a key voter concern centers around something that Biden cannot possibly change, it begs the question, what can the Democrats do? The Biden campaign appears to want to limit and control public appearances to decrease the likelihood of missteps. But media specialist Dan Kennedy says they can only convince voting Americans by letting them see as much of Biden as possible.
They have to convince them to get out there and meet voters, give speeches, sit down for interviews with reporters, which he's been very reluctant to do. And, you know, if he performs well, I think that will answer the questions. If he doesn't perform well, I suppose that doesn't solve the problem, but I don't know that it makes it any bigger a problem than they have already. So I think they need to take the chance and get him out there.
With the general election now in full swing, the Biden campaign has 8 months to do just that. To get the president to show what he is still capable of at 81, despite the risks of slips along the way.
Well, that report from our Washington correspondent Janelle Dumoulin, and I asked Janelle about the Democrats' non-Biden options.
Well, Phil, there's what's possible and then there's what's plausible or likely, and obviously one of those categories is wider than the other. If we're talking about what's possible, then it makes sense to look at the next natural candidate in line, Vice President Kamala Harris. But seeing that she's polling even more unfavorably than Joe Biden at this point, that doesn't make her a feasible non-Biden option. You know, there are any number of names in the Democrat Party that could be considered as potential heirs to Biden. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, the Governor of California, Gavin Newsom. But the fact of the matter is, any one of these people would have needed a lot more runway at a much earlier point. And in an electoral tradition where the incumbent almost always puts himself forward as the nominee, almost always runs for re-election, I guess the real answer to whether there's a feasible non-option Biden is really no, unless, of course, he steps aside, which we've established he is unlikely to do.
OK. And why aren't we having this conversation about Donald Trump, who's only 4 years younger than Joe Biden?
I mean, this is a fair question. So Trump has had his fair share of mental stumbles in public as well. I would say they make a comparable number of gaffes. So if Biden would confuse the leaders of Mexico and Egypt, Trump would confuse Biden and Obama, for example. But perception is reality here. And, you know, voters, they really do perceive Joe Biden as much older than Donald Trump. Biden walks and talks slower. Trump just seems more robust. And fairly or unfairly, Biden's age is a problem for Biden in a way that Trump's age is less of a problem for Trump. But that isn't to say that the electorate doesn't have its issues with Trump. In this Gallup poll that says that a majority of Americans would not vote for a candidate over 80, that same poll says they would also not vote for a convicted felon. So seeing that Donald Trump has 91 charges across 4 cases, you also can't consider that a non-issue for the electorate. Biden and Trump fall into either of these categories, but it would be too simple to say they simply cancel each other out.
Quick word then about President Biden's State of the Union address tonight. I'm guessing he'll try and convince voters he's still fit for office. What are we expecting to hear?
Yeah, so this is going to be the last State of the Union address before the election. So de facto, it's a campaign speech. He's expected to highlight his economic record, the defense of democracy, the Democrats' efforts to safeguard reproductive rights. But of course, it's not just his message, but his delivery that will be key here. Voters need to see vigor and energy so that he can dispel notions that he's no longer fit for office.
Thanks, Janelle. Janelle Dumoulin in Washington. Sweden has formally joined NATO as the 32nd member of the transatlantic military alliance, ending decades of post-war neutrality. At a ceremony in Washington, Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson called it a victory for freedom. Stockholm joined the alliance amid concerns about Russian aggression following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago. Sweden's accession to NATO comes as Germany's defence minister travels through Scandinavia. Boris Pistorius is looking for a potential blueprint for the reintroduction of conscription here in Germany, but the task will require significant political backing.
German Defence Minister Boris Pistorius is on a 4-day tour of Scandinavia. An important part of his trip is to look at the models these countries are using for conscription. Because of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, there are new geopolitical realities and threats. And there's a growing realization that the German Bundeswehr not only lack resources, but people too.
We are investigating a step that you have already taken. We suspended conscription in 2011. Now we are looking into reactivating it, and we are looking at the Swedish model.
Each year, Sweden contacts all 18-year-olds and then selects around 30,000 men and women for the recruitment process. Of these, around 8,000 are then actually called up for the 1-year training course. Moving on to Norway, Pistorius saw military conscripts in action up close. They help protect the almost 200-kilometer-long border with Russia. The recruits are very aware that they need to be able to defend themselves and their country, should they have to.
It hits us first. we have to be at our best at all time.
You feel like you actually do a job. We're not just training, we actually do something real.
In Germany, there are some hurdles when it comes to recruitment. The biggest one would be changing the constitution to allow men and women to be conscripted. And that can only be done with a 2/3 majority in parliament. Nonetheless, the German defense minister is adamant his country can learn from Scandinavia.
The conscripts with no officers over there, just doing their job and loving it, and doing it very, very efficiently and with a lot of passion. I was really impressed by talking to them. I'm also impressed by the high proportion of service women in the Norwegian army, which is about 40%. It's a long way to go for the German army still.
An exchange of best practice is a strong element of NATO's military alliance. With Sweden and Finland having joined recently, Scandinavian approaches will feature even more prominently in discussions on conscription going forward.
Thousands of flights and trains across Germany will be cancelled this week. Lufthansa and Deutsche Bahn staff are going on strike. It's the latest in a series of walkouts in different sectors, including transport, the civil service and supermarkets. Workers want higher wages to cope with shrinking purchasing power. Around 200,000 air passengers will be affected over 2 days, as well as millions of train travellers. Delays and cancellations are expected until Saturday. And finally, here's an example of the animal kingdom taking over a very human domain. A huge mob of kangaroos took over a golf course in Melbourne, hopping through the fairways, greens and sand bunkers, bouncing along the grass and leaving players astonished. Here's what one golfer filmed as he was about to hit his shot. And with that, you're up to date. Stay with me for the day in just a moment as China's parliament convenes for its annual meeting to rubber stamp Xi Jinping's vision for the country. We'll take a closer look at the relationship between China and the United States. That's on the day with me in just a moment.